Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hi. Over in my video about believing the incomprehensible, someone by the name of Chaosism posed some questions relating to the nature of time and eternity, and whether that doesn't make time an illusion and so on. So I want to address some of those questions here. Now, by the way, I'm sick, so please pardon me for everything related to that. So the way I want to begin, and sort of most of the theme, is about how many truths are in fact relative, and that relative things are, well, relative. Now, there's a great scene in Star Wars, which I'm not going to include, copyright law being what it is, but where Obi-Wan tells Luke, "So what I told you was true from a certain point of view." And Luke asks, "A certain point of view?" And Obi-Wan says, "Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view." This has been taken in various ways, but it's actually a very true observation. Many of the things that we believe in depend on our point of view, not for their truth, but rather for the specificity of what those beliefs in fact are. Basically, a lot of things are in fact relative. Now, this can be taken in a very stupid way, where people say, there is therefore no truth. No, there's truth. Moreover, the longer I live, the older I get, the less I believe that anybody actually thinks that all things are relative, that there's no such thing actually as truth. As far as I can see, every place I've ever seen this, every place I've ever heard about it being invoked, have all just been situations where people want to get out of a conversation, and this is a way that will shut down all conversations, because if you deny that two people can actually talk to each other, well, there's nothing to do but stop talking to each other. So the mere fact that this can be done stupidly doesn't mean that no truths are relative, however. And so I want to consider in particular relative properties. Now, a good example of this is, say, local motion. That's to say, the motion of things in space, the changing of distances between things. Now, consider driving along in a car. If I'm riding in a car, I am not moving relative to the seat. The seat is not moving relative to me. The distance between us is staying fixed. So if you want to use, you can invoke special relativity, but you don't need to. Relative to me, the seat is stationary. It is not moving. Relative to the ground, the seat is moving. Which of those is true? Well, actually, they're both true, because it's just a matter of specifying what relationship are you talking about. The distance between a point on the ground and that seat is changing. The distance between me and that seat is not changing. And by the way, that doesn't mean it is simultaneously moving and not moving. That means that motion is a relative property. You have to specify what you're talking about. So a more important one, or the one that's more important to the moment rather, is the property of order or dependence. Now consider a logical argument, one that's phrased well, parsimoniously, where it's not extraneous, and we're talking about a valid argument. You can't change the order of this thing without changing what the argument is. The argument actually depends upon its order. Things follow from what came before them, but if you change the order, they will cease to follow. And so the order is actually intrinsic to such an argument. Not necessarily to all pieces. It is possible, say, to establish one thing, establish another thing, and then finally use the two of them being true for something. So you could swap this part around. So that is to say, not all orders of things are intrinsically dependent, but there is a definite intrinsic ordering to at least large chunks of a logical argument, where those things cannot be violated. Those things cannot be rearranged without changing what the argument is. And this makes it a property of the argument. Now, time has the same property. The moments of time depend upon each other in an order, that things happen from what happened before. Now, an example I would like to use is that of a book. Now, bear in mind, this is an extremely limited example, because the author of a book exists in time, and the book exists, technically the actual physical book exists in time, but we don't really think of them existing in time. There's this copy. If I held up a second copy, in some sense, they are the same book. They are not different books. And in the sense in which they are the same book, that book doesn't really exist in time. However, that book does have an internal chronology to it. That book does have an internal order. So, and it is true that, I can flip to page 82 and then flip to page 32, and then I could read them in that order. They won't, of course, make very much sense to me if I was starting that way, because they would not have their, proper internal ordering. Now, I'm using this book in particular because I actually wrote this one. And so as the author, once I wrote it, and the things, went through and happened, the characters did what the characters did, I can then, having seen what a character is doing on page 115, I'm pulling this example at random, obviously, go back to page 14 and throw in some sort of foreshadowing that the characters don't understand. Well, I could throw in some foreshadowing just, in an authorial voice, and that's really, really easy because, the characters don't get to hear the author speaking to the reader. But I could even throw in something that some character knows, like a prophecy, for example, something like that. As long as the characters don't understand it at that point, and it doesn't change any of their actions, then I can throw that foreshadowing in based on what happened later, and I have not changed what the book is. I have not violated the internal ordering to the book. I have not introduced a plot hole, essentially. And so that is an analogy for how the ordering of the book is quite real for the book, and the things within the book are bound by the ordering of the book. They're bound by the dependence. Somebody can't use a power before he has discovered how to use the power. That would not make any sense. That's not doable in a consistent sense. That would, introduce plot holes. You can have books with plot holes. You can't have reality with plot holes. Again, this analogy breaks down in all sorts of ways if you try to push it. So please don't try to push it. It's meant as a very, very limited analogy. But it does show the difference between the reality to the book of its ordering and the reality of being bound by its ordering within the book. But I am not bound by that because I am not inside the book. But that doesn't make the binding to that order not real for the book, because the book is not me. So this is sort of that fundamental distinction which then applies to time. That time, being a collection of moments which do not contain each other, has an ordering, it has a dependence to it, inherent in it, and this is real for all of those of things like us that are in time. We are bound by time, and that being bound by time is quite real. We cannot change the past. We can guess at the future, but we can't know the future. We can only do things in the moment. That is very real for us. This is how we actually act. This is how that is the nature of this reality. But God is not bound by that. So that binding is in that sense not real to God, but is real to us, because that binding is itself, merely a property of some things and not a universal. The ordering is, however, a universal. To God, we exist in this order. All of that exists, with equal presence to God, but in that order, in that dependence. And in the same way, you see this, by the way, within, just like I mentioned the foreshadowing in the book, you see that in regard to things like prophecies, where people don't understand prophecies in the moment, but then come to understand them afterwards. You see that same thing where causality is not being violated, but the presence of all moments does allow, certain interactions that do not violate the causality involved. So, that is basically, I think, the answer to the question. It's not a perfect answer, and unfortunately there can be no really good analogies to standing outside of time, because we're inside of time. We have no experience of anything standing outside of time. We only have experience of things which are inside of time. And so all analogies are going to have to be very, very poor. I wish it could be better, but inherently they can't be. There's no possible way for things inside of time to have a direct experience of being outside of time. So, that's the inherent limitation of such analogies, and given that is one of the better analogies that I know, and that is, in any event, the key to understanding the whole thing, is to understand the relativity of the relationships being discussed. To see all moments as present is not to violate the order of those moments. It's not to violate the nature of those moments. It's to have a different nature. It's to stand in a different relationship to them than they stand in each other. But standing in a different relationship to them does not change the relationship they stand into each other. And that doesn't mean that God violates the relationship these things have to each other. God is other. So again, Cassism is, so far as I know, an atheist or an agnostic. I don't know his or her position. I'm just pretty sure Cassism is certainly not a Christian. I'm very confident that Cassism is not a Christian. So, anyhow, could even be mistaken about that. But so, just to sum up, I'm not saying that this proves the nature of God or anything like that. Obviously, it doesn't. What it does do, however, is explain what is meant by this and how it is a rational concept and how none of this is an illusion. It's just that there are different relationships, and so when talking about relationships, you have to specify which. They're all real, but they're not all the same. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.